Welcome to episode 8 of the Argue With Me podcast. This time I speak with Hanno Sauer, who is a professor of philosophy, and he wrote an article, a paper really, called The End of History, which ruffled a lot of feathers, really got a lot of attention. I'm going to read a bit of the abstract to you, just so you understand sort of where he's coming from and what we talk about. And so this is the abstract to his paper. What credence should we assign to philosophical claims that were formed without any knowledge of the current state of the art of the philosophical debate and little or no knowledge of the relevant empirical or scientific data? Hanno's answer? Very little or none. So you can see why this might have ruffled some feathers, because philosophy, unlike other academic subjects, really pays a lot of attention to its own past. Discussions from thousands of years ago are treated as if they're still relevant today or as if they're unsettled somehow. And we discuss why that is, what we can do about it, whether we should do something about it, and the utility of the way philosophy is taught right now, if there is any at all. I hope you enjoy.
This article, which is, and I'll totally let you explain the meat of it, but essentially it's just asking the reader, by the way, very politely, to consider using more modern information as a starting point for doing philosophy. And I want to say right at the outset, and correct, don't let me put words in your mouth, but I think it's safe to say we probably both love philosophy. You're a professor of philosophy. I'm not, but I'm just interested in it. I love reading it.
Too.
I enjoy
Me
it.
too.
I like reading the classics. I like Kant.
I
like Plato. It's all good.
Same.
And nobody here today is complaining about them. And I don't want either of us to be accused of that. So I thought I'd say
that's right. I'm a bit surprised that you said that I raised this challenge politely, because I think I wasn't trying to be polite. I tried to piss people off a little bit. But you're right that I had no idea it would succeed in that regard to this extent. It blew up massively. I thought it would be read by maybe 10 people, but that was very much not the case. And I think it trended like for 5 hours or something on social media, and it got an enormous attention. And now people keep asking me, "Are you the history guy, right? You're the end of history guy." And so this is going to haunt me forever, even though it's just like a kind of side project that I did for some reason. So I try to. Well, I mean, I try to not be deliberately impolite, but I try to tease people a little bit, and that seems has worked. And you're right. I've nothing against. I mean, quite the opposite. I greatly enjoy reading many philosophers that we would classify as historical. I have my favorites. Always loved Schopenhauer, but also the other big ones, Kant and Hegel and Heidegger and so on, Nietzsche. But still, I think many people who are interested in philosophy, who get paid to do philosophy, do philosophy in some way professionally, have this question in the back of their minds: what is it that we do? What are our methods? Why don't we appear to have that many agreed upon methods, uncontroversial methods? Why do the methods and the subjects and so on, the questions, the issues, why do they appear to not be fixed? Why do they appear to be elusive and in flux and so on? And that always positions philosophy in this awkward place where philosophers themselves have this self-impression that somehow we need to justify what it is that we're doing. And if we get into the business of justifying it, it's an open question whether that attempt will be successful. So it could be that part of philosophy, all of it, turns out to be not so legitimate, not so solid, and not so serious after all. But there is this ongoing quest: how do we make philosophy, like Kant said, enter this sort of secure territory of the sciences? This how do we emulate the success of the sciences? Philosophy used to be everything, and now it's increasingly less and less and less, because we differentiate out these other subjects: physics, biology, chemistry, the sort of usual story, and that puts some justificatory pressure on philosophy to explain what its methods are. And once you start doing that, you quickly see sometimes there's no obvious explanation for why, for instance, there should be so much historical navel gazing, because for a discipline that aims at epistemic goods, knowledge, understanding, insight, whatever it is, it's at least somewhat surprising that so much of it is expected to come from very old texts in a way in which other disciplines that aim at similar epistemic goods, knowledge, understanding of nature, of the material world or the living world, and so on and so on, these disciplines don't rely on these old texts so much, even though they do have them as well, right? They have the Newton and the Darwin and so on and so on. But they don't rely on that, and that calls for an explanation. I think a lot of people see the need for that explanation, and I try to spell out, I think, what the challenge really consists in precisely, and consider some responses and try to make it as strong as I could.
Yeah, well, okay, there. So at the end, you tried to make it as strong as you could. I think that's not rude. Like when I read this,
okay, yeah.
just to go back, like I think that some people may have perceived this as being impolite, but I've read it a couple times now to get a good grasp on it, and I really think the only reason I know you knew that this might annoy some people when you were writing it, but I don't get the sense that you wrote it to annoy people. So
no,
to
that's
me,
true.
So to me,
that's
it doesn't come off as rude. So when you make a good analogy, like nobody teaches physics with the Principia, right? That might seem biting or rude to somebody, but to me, it's just fair comment, right? Like that is it's a great analogy.
Yeah.
And so like to sort of encapsulate what you're maybe saying here is that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it's just sort of hard to explain why philosophy still hangs its hat when being taught on these older texts. And this is not an argument against teaching history of philosophy. It's just begs, or it calls for an answer as to, like, how did this happen? Why do people do that when it's really not the only way to teach philosophy? It's like it's not the only way to teach physics or psychology or whatever it is. So what is it that why do you think this happens, or how has it come about like this?
I mean, sometimes people say that we need to do this and we need to keep doing this to prevent our discipline from reinventing the wheel, right? So we need to go back, otherwise we're going to repeat the same mistakes. And I think that argument, usually people get away with that argument much too easily, because I think it's nowhere near persuasive. First of all, again, it just repeats the problem, which is that apparently these other disciplines, they succeed in not reinventing the wheel without taking that detour through older texts. And second of all, I think the suggestion to if that were the suggestion, right? I'm not that radical, but if the suggestion to ignore the history of philosophy or to de-emphasize its importance in research and teaching is not to throw away all the wheels and start from the first shitty wheel thousands of years ago, right? The suggestion is to take the best currently available wheel and keep working on that, right? So there's no danger of reinventing it. So sometimes people mistake that suggestion that we should toss out all philosophy, right, and start from scratch, when my suggestion is exactly the opposite. It's to start from where we are now. So the danger of reinventing the wheel, Bernard Williams, for instance, famously made this point, but many others. So the go-to objection is that we're going to repeat all these past mistakes. I think that objection totally doesn't work. And the suggestion to do philosophy more ahistorically is the opposite. It's to proceed from the best currently available wheel and to keep improving that, because in a way, the previous wheels, and with all their pros and cons, all their flaws and benefits, they are contained sort of in the design of the current wheels, and have been improved likewise. Now that already contains a controversial picture of what philosophy is and how it's done that not everyone has to agree with, but at least this sort of shoot from the hip objection that de-emphasizing the importance of the history of philosophy means that you'll start to make these infantile mistakes like the pre-Socratics. That is nowhere near what I'm suggesting, and I don't think that follows at all. So I think that's one thing that people often say. Now, but there's also a historical kind of causal question that you're asking is, why is the discipline this way? Right? There are some disciplines where it's normal. You would think that, for instance, certain humanistic subjects, they keep studying Shakespeare. I don't think that's surprising, right? They bring it up time and again. These are artworks that speak to people still, and there is value in training people to encounter them, right? And so people are going to keep reading Thomas Mann and Goethe. It's just that's part of what the humanistic aspect of these disciplines is, and there is a part of philosophy that is like that as well, and that's good, right? It's fine to have to read old authors in a humanistic way, and with that kind of epistemic interest in just contextualizing historical works, see how they fit into their time, and so on and so on. So that's not surprising that that part of philosophy would be historically oriented. I think there is some subset, however large, some subset of philosophy that is oriented towards these epistemic aims, trying to achieve knowledge, understanding of how the mind works, how natural laws work, how cognition works, what morality amounts to, what a just society is, and so on and so on. All of these questions. And there, your question is, how come that subset of philosophy is so relatively, well, disproportionately focused on historical text and teaching and research?
That's right.
And I can only speculate. I mean, knowing a bit about the history of philosophy would perhaps help, but it's too late for that. Well, I'm guessing that famously, philosophy used to be just the, for the longest time, was just the term for what the pursuit of knowledge was, right? That's how in ancient times it was understood, and then you would distinguish between the first philosophy, the metaphysics, and so on, and different types of just like pursuing knowledge, what we would call science or scientific endeavor in general. And still, you've mentioned Newton's Principia. They still consider themselves to be natural philosophy, right? What we would now call science or physics, but at the time it was still called philosophy. But what happened again was, as various disciplines found somewhat dependable methods, either mathematical ones or empirical ones in experimentation, often you see that these fields started to take off and to develop their own life, right? And it's when physicists started doing experiments, sort of reproducible interventions into the natural world to see how cause and effect hang together, and to study how to mathematically describe the interaction of motion and matter and so on and so on. And then when biologists started figuring out, we can do breeding experiments, for instance, and we see that, if we can do interventions into nature and see exactly how these mechanisms work with genetics, with evolutionary theory, it's basically, rooted in breeding experiments. That's when these fields started to become separated from the a priori, say, way of doing biology, psychology, and natural philosophy. And they sort of they engaged in that disciplinary patricide, so to speak, and left philosophy to do their own thing. And philosophers are still licking their wounds as a result of this development, and they feel, what are we still in charge of? We still want to think about the mind and about life and about nature, but no one listens to us. It's not true, of course, but there is that self-deprecating kind of, who are we really, and who needs us kind of anxiety, I think, that a lot of philosophy has, that also makes people react somewhat nervously when people say, okay, there's a part of philosophy that may not be as reliable as we tend to think it is.
Yeah, so that's interesting. An interesting analysis of it, that philosophers in some ways, and of course we're speaking very generally here, are licking their wounds from the separation of science and well, philosophy being everything prior, right? And since philosophy was everything, it always came with like an aesthetic, right? So even some of the more hard, rigid, and I mean that in a good way, like precise thinking that philosophers used to do, would often still be accompanied by some kind of aesthetic that you could paint. That didn't really have to, it didn't have to exist, that aesthetic, but so it does seem like there was a divorce there between like
exactly. I fully agree, and I also think that much of the aesthetic in mainstream, what's called analytic philosophy, perhaps, so mainstream philosophy in the Anglophone world and the places that are in dialogue with it, like the Netherlands or Germany, whatever. Much of the mainstream philosophy for the past decades, for the past 100-ish years, but less really, has sought solace or perhaps shelter in trying to emulate the methods, simulate the methods and the style of these envied disciplines like physics and mathematics to the greatest extent possible. So there's been a lot of emphasis on formalism, on clarity, on expunging all personality out of the writing to make it basically reproducible. A lot of focus on arguments, on clear definitions of concepts, sometimes even too clear. Clarity for its own sake, all in the service of, or much of it in the service of emulating this coveted ideal of precision and robustness that we thought we could find in the hard sciences, and that has generated, well, another wave of thinking about how should we do philosophy in the first place, especially since in the past 10, 20 years or so, trust in that kind of paradigm has increasingly eroded, maybe even more than 20. And the hope that if only we proceed by modeling philosophy after the natural sciences, by being as formal as we can, being as conceptually clear as we can, making everything explicit, leaving nothing implicit, leaving as little as possible open to interpretation, getting rid of all personal style and individuality in the writing. If only we did that for long enough, we would finally separate the what is it, the chaff from the
wheat,
the wheat from the chaff, and be accepted in the realm of the hard sciences as well. But that also didn't happen.
Right. So I'm going to ask you a little bit about how we should actually go about doing philosophy these days, but I don't want to move off this topic so far or yet of like what's gone wrong or that type of thing. And I want to relate to you something. I'd love to get your thoughts on this that I have had happen to me several times, and it's about the supposed paradox of the ship of Theseus. I'm sure you're aware of the ship of Theseus. And for anybody who isn't, it's not that complicated. It's just there's a ship. It's called the ship. It's Theseus's ship. The question is one about identity, is what philosophers will say about how many boards on this ship can you change before it's a new ship, right? Or if you took all of the old boards off over time and built a ship with those, is that still the ship of Theseus? Now, I'll tell you a little bit about my background. This won't take long. I have a science degree. It's in psychology, and I went to law school. And when I hear a question like this, it's because I'm very scientifically minded. I incline that way. I think this isn't really a problem. Okay, so you had a system of particles, right, in the quantum field that you called the ship of Theseus at time zero. Well, if you fast forward at time t equals 1000, whatever number you're picking, all of those particles are somewhere, and you could find them. Okay, and now it's your label you put on that original system, so there's no right answer here. Like it's an arbitrary. For the physics are totally clear, the math is totally clear. So to sit there and argue for centuries about whether it's still the ship of Theseus is silly to me. It's like, do you want to call it that? Does everybody know what you mean when you call it that? Like the London Symphony Orchestra, the people in it change over time, but do we still know what you mean when you use those words? I think so,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, I think so too.
Like, yeah. So, but this paradox is still brought up over
Yeah.
and over and over again, hundreds of years later. It's not even that interesting to me.
Yeah.
But when I say this to philosophers, and I mean professional philosophers, they tell me I'm misunderstanding the question. And
Yeah.
I say, I don't think I am, though. I know you're saying it's about personal
I don't think you
identity.
are.
Yeah, exactly.
I
I
don't
go,
think you are.
I'm like, I don't see how I'm misunderstanding it. You think it's about personal identity. I've just explained to you how that's a red herring. You're gonna never get an answer to that because it's basically a category error that you're making, and you're just not accepting that answer. But nobody ever accepts my answer to this, ever.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
I don't understand why. It seems so clear.
I mean, people. I mean, look, it's going to be hard to. There's this famous line that it's going to be hard to convince someone that something is false when that person not believing that it's false, when the livelihood of that person depends on that person not believing it's false.
Right.
Right. So it's always going. There's going to be a strong vested interest, literally, in thinking that no, these problems are real, because I'm being paid to solve them. Right. So that's one thing. But I agree. There are many of these classical philosophical problems that people are nerding out about that I never had much time for. It's Theseusship, and maybe there are some paradoxes that you think are interesting. Maybe there are some paradoxes that I think are interesting. But there is a class of problems that sort of feel similar. Theseusship, the Sorites, the lottery paradox, the forward paradox, and so on. And I never thought these are even problems. I thought like these are all, yeah. So the forward paradox is, it seems that you've written each line in the book because you believe it, but then in the forwards you say, sure, I've made mistakes. So it seems that you believe each proposition, but you don't believe all of them. And how can it be that you believe the conjunction of all the propositions, but not the conjunction of all the propositions? And it makes no sense to me. You kind of believe in each proposition to some degree, right? But overall, you don't think that you've made no mistakes in this book. So many of, just an example,
Yeah.
I think many of these problems are also, in a way, why original analytic philosophy was invented, is where people said, hold on, these seem to be problems that are created by a confusing use of your language.
Yeah.
Right. If you only look at it carefully, if you just ask, do we still, if someone asks you where's Theseus shipped, can you point it out? And if the answer is yes, then what's the problem?
Yeah.
All right. Or the orchestra example is a good one, where there's no one, but I saw a picture and these are different people, right?
Right.
I saw a picture from the 50s, so that can't be the lump. It makes no sense.
Yeah.
It's, frankly, I sometimes think it's a little bit embarrassing that there are adults working on these problems, taxpayer funded. But okay, who am I to judge? Right? There's also genuine unclarity about what the methods and the good questions are. So I do think people should be allowed to do that, right? Because we don't have settled answers to these questions. And if the experts on these questions want to engage in that work, I would let them. It's just that I will also claim the privilege to judge that I think what they are doing is not that important or interesting. And people make a living out of the Sorites paradox, and they take a stance on, is it a heap, or is heap actually vague? Is it like objectively vague? And I have very little time for that. So I agree with you. People should be, by all means, let 1,000 flowers bloom. And it is, in a way, also the strength of philosophy that it allows these quirky and far-fetched questions to thrive and people to think very deeply about them, because sometimes we do discover, here's an interesting consequence. We find out something about how reasoning works, for instance, right? And then it works in unexpected ways. So I do think this should exist. But within philosophy, I also say that within philosophy and within people being entitled to do philosophy like that, I personally also think that this makes no sense, right? And people are invited to disagree with me. And many people, so I do. You said that you're very scientifically minded. I think I am too. I think a lot of interesting philosophical questions are very deeply entangled with scientific questions and sort of the conceptual strengths of philosophy when they pair up with the worldly richness of empirical disciplines that can lead to good results. But many people think that is a dead end, right? Many people think that we can't get anything philosophically interesting out of looking at these studies and so on and so on. And maybe they're right. I'm happy to entertain that possibility. very much. But I think that kind of quarrel also within the discipline is normal and healthy, and people, and there's no need to get upset either way about.
Oh, I agree. Yeah.
These things.
Yeah, so that's a good jumping off point for something else I'd written down that I wanted to ask you about. There's and this is by no means from all philosophers. Again, I keep qualifying myself here, but there is a hostility towards science that I've read into. And by the way, I'm not like a Neil deGrasse type where deGrasse Tyson type where I go around and just hey, that's not scientifically correct. I've just noticed that there is a hostility towards science from some philosophers, and it possibly is explained by the explanation about that divorce we were talking about earlier. But at the same time, it seems like every time I encounter this, it's with a very intelligent person who just seems to have a blind spot, and then their own work is worse because they don't bother to grapple with what a scientist might say about it, and they just dismiss it as like, oh yeah, but that's like non-overlapping magisterium or something like this, right? It's like, how can you live in this universe, want to make conclusions about what we ought to do or who somebody ought to do or how we ought to think or why, and then have hostility towards science? It just blows my mind. Like
I think that attitude does exist. I would say that it exists less than it used to be, even 10, 20, 50 years ago, where it was very strong, I think. Because so that's one thing. It's less prominent these days. It does exist, and when you encounter it in the wild, it's pointless and it's not even annoying. It's a kind of like there's a kind of condescension from below.
Yeah,
right.
That's exactly it.
It's kind of like it reeks of status anxiety about am I even a legitimate intellectual, and I feel threatened by you. It's by people hating whatever the prettiest girl in the bar or something, right? Because they feel threatened by her. That's happens, but it's less so than it used to be, and that's one thing. I also think that it can sometimes be legitimate because there are some scientists who encroach upon philosophy in a way that's bad.
Absolutely.
So there are some scientists who are neglectful about some important distinctions in philosophy that would help them think more clearly about the philosophical problems that they want to address. And that conceptual naivete combined with overconfidence that comes from the authority that science bestows upon them, that can also be annoying. So I think part of that hostility is because philosophers are, maybe they had some early encounters with annoying scientists like that, and then they generalize across the board. But I think not by no means all scientists are like that. Many are interested in what are these distinctions that philosophy can offer us, and when they do look at them, often they realize, oh yeah, there are some complications that we underestimated, and there are some conceptual distinctions that you can't make from, say, within physics, because it's not about physics, right? It's about how do you think about a subject matter. Perhaps the worst discipline in this regard is the free will debate, where every 5 years you have a scientist of that kind. Like I said, it's a small number of them, but it does sometimes happen, and they write a book about free will, and it's just hilarious. It's terrible. And then philosophers get I don't know, I guess butthurt about it or something. How can you do this to us? And you should, you sort of people performatively proving that they're ignoring philosophers, and it's this toxic dynamic. Not always, but I think that could explain this hostility between some subset of these two tribes. Is that some philosophers are also scientifically and empirically uninformed, misinformed, or ignorant,
or hostile,
or hostile and reluctant and don't want anything to do with it, right?
Yeah.
And some scientists are also reluctant to engage with the philosophical questions. Happens sometimes, and then you get that equilibrium of hostility. But I think in recent years, there's been a lot of progress of scientists becoming very interested in, for instance, in moral psychology. A lot of scientists becoming very interested in, okay, what are these philosophically interesting distinctions? How do we operationalize moral thinking, for instance, right? Are people more consequentialist? Like, do they think the outcomes matter for moral evaluation? Or do people think something else matters, like the intentions or the rules people follow? And then all of a sudden, when you want to operationalize this in an experiment, in a study that involves human subjects, it's very useful to have a bunch of people who've been thinking about these questions for decades, and that turns out to be very helpful to a lot of psychologists. And likewise, a lot of philosophers are wondering, okay, what goes on in the mind when people make moral judgments? And it turns out that empirical methods are very helpful for addressing that to a large extent. And that there's been a lot of fruitful discourse. I think a lot of deliberate attempts to also avoid that kind of hostility, but it does happen.
Okay, so this is a good segue into like how we should be doing philosophy, how philosophy should be done, but also like we're touching on also like how should science be done a little bit. We're even running into now, and like my sort of I think reason I'm not going to name a bunch of names here. Some of my favorite philosophers, and I'm talking about modern living people, are really smart and they're good at pulling from economics, and they're going to pull from evolutionary psychology, and they're going to pull from all kinds of scientific fields. They don't feel so constrained because they're not an economist and they're not an evolutionary scientist, but they're so good at marrying these things together into a story that might explain. And I don't mean that pejoratively. I mean like a potentially very useful theoretical story. So I start to see philosophers as really good theoreticians, and you mentioned something that's useful about philosophy is that people let their thoughts run all over the place, right? So here's what I'd love to get you this. I'm just thinking about this as you were talking earlier. Like we have theoretical physicists whose thoughts are allowed to run all over the place within bounds, though. So like you could right now argue for the multiverse, and I don't intend to do that, but just as an example. But an experimental result could come by in 3 days that you realize, okay, the multiverse is no longer a really good explanation, and you're going to let it drop, and no one will ever argue for it again, right? So is the answer here undoing that divorce we spoke about earlier, and maybe marrying the two, like the scientific mindset and the philosophical mindset again? And I'd just like to get your thoughts on basically what
I mean, I just read this. I'm not a philosopher of science, or I'm not in theoretical philosophy, but I kind of like dabble in it, and I try to be a little bit up to date, at least, but by no means an expert or an insider. But I read this book by Michael Strevens, I don't know the name. I think it's an Australian philosopher from NYU, and he wrote this book, The Knowledge Machine. It's a very interesting book, well written and really cool book. And he argues that the success of modern science, why modern science took off, is essentially explained by irrationality. What he means by that is an obsessive focus on one thing, and pretty much one thing only, that he calls the iron law of explanation, or the iron rule of explanation, which is that really the final and almost only arbiter when it comes to deciding between competing theories and empirical sciences are empirically validated observations, right? So whereas in back in the day, in ancient times, people would think that when it comes to picking between or choosing between theories, all kinds of considerations are admitted into the mix: aesthetics, elegance, mathematical support, also observation, coherence with observation and with experience, but many other considerations. And modern science became so great and so successful and so enormously vindicated by the past couple hundred years, because it really obsessively focused on only this one type of consideration, is to only look at, can we just make a decision between these two theories on the basis of the verdict of experience, basically. And it's really plausibly shown in this book how this works, and how really that's the essence of the scientific method in the end. It's not really a method, it's more of a focus that creates that underpins all all other methods in science. But yeah, so you said that maybe we should think about this marriage between the disciplines. Now there are unhappy marriages, right?
Yeah.
So marrying two things doesn't mean that it's going to go so well. It could, right? But I personally I often tend to think about it in terms of the inherent arbitrariness of these disciplinary boundaries. What I mean by that is, of course, that I work in a building that says philosophy on it, right? And other people work in the law department, and other people work in the biology department, right? So there's different labels on these buildings. But sometimes, not often, but sometimes people say, well, it's what you do. It's what you do. You know, when they talk to me, they ask me, is what you do really philosophy? Is that still philosophy? And I find myself not caring so much about that. What I tend to focus on is I'm interested in certain topics, right? So for instance, I'm interested in understanding moral change and moral progress. You know, is that a thing? How does it work? What do we need what do we need in order to describe this adequately and to understand this to an extent where we are satisfied? And it's really, to me, the interest in the topic, moral progress. And I'm going to use any discipline that will help me illuminate that topic. And if I do this in a way that will make 51% of people from my discipline, that will disincline them to still classify that as philosophy, I will shrug. I don't think I will be very upset about by that. So in a way, that is a kind of like maybe it's not marriage, but it's a sort of practiced polyamory, informal polyamory between the disciplines that I think you need to do if you want to get a good purchase on some topics. So I think there's no fully a priori, fully just philosophical way of thinking about how moral progress works and how it is. You need to look at history, you need to look at political science, sociology, evolutionary psychology, economics, and so on and so on to understand this process and the things that make up this process. And you also need to do a little bit of philosophy to see what are there maybe meta-ethical presuppositions that we're smuggling in? Are there maybe normative principles that we are smuggling in? All of these sorts of questions, and that's normal. That's just like.
Can I let me put this to you? I think that there's one field of philosophy that really does well today, and I think that's political philosophy. I'm not sure if that's the only field of philosophy that does really well.
That does well today, you mean?
Yeah, okay. I think, and the reason I think that is because, well, and maybe this is just a selection bias in the authors I read, but there's room to argue and theorize about how human beings should conduct their affairs. But these people who argue, and I mean strictly political philosophy. I know there are other sections that study politics that are not so rigid, but the people that do that normally will take into account actual data from real economic studies and psychological studies and that sort of thing. So like, hey, okay, it's great to read Nozick and it's great to read Rawls and there's your theory. Now you can go out in the real world and see actually how these things work out, and it's possible to do that, right? And I find political philosophy is really good at like, well, at least better than a lot of other. And I'm wondering if that is, I don't know if it's because they feel more responsibility or if it's particular. I mean, because if you get that one wrong and people listen to you, there's big trouble. But if you get like, oh, hey, the ship of Theseus, just to stick on the theme, you get that wrong, nothing happens.
Of course. It's an interesting question. I'm actually inclined to agree with you. I also find a lot of stuff in political philosophy, and I have done so over the past years, that I found interesting and enlightening. And helpful for thinking about where we are and how modern societies are working. So here's one thing that might have happened, which is that at some point there's going to be an exhaustion of the dominant paradigm in any discipline, and then people look for alternatives. In political philosophy, the dominant paradigm in a way, well, so in a in a way that was so dominant that you didn't find it really in the other philosophical subdisciplines was kind of Rawlsian ideal theory, right? People operated often explicitly within a Rawlsian project, and they tried to understand justice and just institutions in society from within that framework, which was, among other things, very much an ideal theory framework. So at least the first half of Rawls's theory of justice operates with that assumption that, okay, first of all, we're going to assume full compliance with the principles of justice, right?
Right.
Which a couple of people recently have argued that assumes away the problem. Right?
Yes.
There is no theory of justice. Justice solves non-compliance, right? There's no need for justice if you have fully compliant people. It's almost like you start economics by saying, okay, first of all, we're going to assume abundance.
Yeah, exactly. I understand.
Right?
Yeah.
It makes no sense. Economics is dealing with the absence of abundance. It's dealing with scarcity. And then you want to figure out, okay, where should the resources go? Right? To whom, to what uses, and so on and so on and so on. So you can't, assuming away scarcity is assuming away the need for economics in the first place. And likewise, a lot of people are now thinking that if you start from, okay, first of all, we're going to assume people are angels, and then we're going to see how we deal with injustice. It's just like makes no sense. There is no problem to solve if people are fully compliant with the principles of justice, and you can't first formulate the principles of justice assuming full compliance, and then you enter the real world and you sort of think that, well, I can still adjust the principles of justice later on once I encounter these people made of flesh and blood. It's not how it works, right? It's not how it works. I think it's David Schmitz. He says at one point that that's exactly what you can't do. You can't figure out your moral principles and then sort out the compliance problems, because picking a moral principle is picking a compliance problem, right? And different moral principles are different compliance problems. And I think that's very much true. So this move towards non-ideal theory, right? Taking people roughly as they are, not as immutable, they can still be malleable, right? But roughly with flaws and warts and so on and so on. That has created the need to look into economics, to look into institutional analysis. And all of a sudden you have people talking about, well, how good is democracy really, right? Does it deliver on its promise? Or you have, where should we rely on this institution? Where should we rely on this institution? And so on and so on and so on. And that is inherently a non-ideal, empirically informed project. And then you get all these other disciplines in the boat. And I don't think as philosophers there is a need to feel bad or anxious about that, because there still is enough to do for philosophers to figure out, okay, how do we think through our moral principles or rules in confrontation with these empirical studies and these empirical insights, right? So there's no need to feel threatened. But of course, these paradigm changes, they'll always have some winners, some losers, and there's going to be some growing pains. And that's what we also see. There's going to be some reluctance by people who don't want to practice that to get into that. But I think the current wave of political philosophy, maybe even the beginning to be dominant wave in political philosophy right now, is more like this PPE style philosophy that tends to be more empirically informed, I think, or tries to be.
Yeah, exactly. Well, so then I guess where I'm going with this then is like, is that how to do philosophy? This sort of new let's call it PPE style, but not necessarily political philosophy.
Yeah.
Is that how you think everybody should proceed?
Yeah. I mean, the term PPE style wouldn't work in epistemology, for instance, but it really is the same thing, is where there's a lot of work in epistemology, for instance, about, well, how do people acquire knowledge, right? It's not so much about analyzing the concept of knowledge in the abstract, and that's epistemology, right? And then it's really about, well, where do people get their knowledge from? How do people share knowledge? How does knowledge spread in society? How do epistemic networks work? What's the connection between justice and knowledge, right? Maybe we don't listen as much to some people because we don't trust them because they are not perceived to be part of the elite or something like that, right? So there's also a connection between inequality and knowledge sharing and the spread of information. How do we understand susceptibility to what appear to us to be falsehoods? How do we understand polarization about certain topics where we wouldn't expect polarization to really come into the picture, but still it does? Factual questions, for instance, right? How do we explain the rise of certain bizarre beliefs like flat Earth stuff or whatever it is, right? That these are all interesting questions in applied epistemology, and they're not PPE because it's not about politics, but they are in a way non-ideal like that. They take human beings with finite minds and faced with incentives and members of groups and wonder, what would a being like that do with information, right? And how would a being like that generate knowledge also over generations? And I think that's what's happening in epistemology as well. I think that's good. I think that's interesting. I think that is at least not the wrong way to do philosophy. And people say interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary too much, right? Because they need to write grants and so on and so on. So you need to drop these words. But it is true. I think that at any rate, philosophy should be done in a way that includes the relevant disciplines. Sometimes when you do philosophy, you end up making claims about the world that can only be confirmed or disconfirmed by knowledge about the world, and the best knowledge about the world that we have comes from various disciplines, various sciences. So I think that's at least one way in which we should.
Well, so yeah, I was thinking. I mean, there's how should we do it, and I think we're sort of intuiting a lot of the same things here in this conversation about how people should think and come to conclusions in general. But there's also like, what can we?
We need to find something to disagree about. This is in the way.
Yeah, that's okay. You know what? Maybe we're just venting here.
Exactly. Yeah.
So what can we do for incentives to get people to try out doing things non-traditionally, so that they stop teaching, Plato as if it's like modern thought? And I had one thought about it, and I'll turn it over to you again too, which is that I feel like past philosophers, as brilliant as they could be, or as much as I like them, often get too much credit. So, for example, they might make a claim about how the human mind works that 300 years later is shown to be true by like a neurological study, and then the person that'll get credit for it isn't the person that did the neurological study, who actually knows that it's true, but the guy that was just sitting there in his armchair going like, I think this is what it is, I have no evidence for this, but and then that person will get like John Locke will get the credit for something that like a neurologist did 300 years later. So
you need to stop right now. I'm gonna get so angry.
Okay.
I'm gonna get so mad.
If we change how that works about credit, do you think that would encourage people to branch out a little, be a little more modern?
It happens all the time. I don't know why people get such a kick out of discovering something that we now know to be true, or that we now have reason to believe to be true, in some guy from yesteryear, and they think, wow, this guy is so insightful, and it can often be true that at the time, that was very insightful, right? But still, it's unusual to credit someone in a way that's supposed to be relevant for the current state of the art. I mean, I praise my kids for all sorts of minor accomplishments, right? They're really not that good at anything, right? But they're 8 years old. Of course, they're not good at anything, right? They couldn't be, but you still kind of praise them. And I think it's a bit like that. Is that you look back at John Locke and you think, oh wow, he thought that we have some thoughts that are memories and some thoughts that are perceptions. This guy is a genius, right? So in fact, one of the pivotal moments in me coming up, not coming up, in me becoming motivated to do this end of history paper was that It must have been 2018, maybe, or something like that. And I was part of the team that taught the introduction to political philosophy at Utrecht University in the second year, I think. And you do it the way you do it, right? You start with, here is a bunch of, here are some parts from Aristotle's Politics, and here are some parts from Plato, and here are some parts from Hobbes, and then you end up with, well, close to present day, some Habermas, Foucault, perhaps Rawls, and so on and so on. Maybe you get into feminist political philosophy if time allows, right? That's how these things are taught.
Sure.
I'm just describing how this.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah.
And we did get to. So I like Hobbes, right? I think he's cool. Okay, I still think. I think the same dynamic applies there. There are many things that we can do better now, and we can explain, with more refined vocabulary. But I think Hobbes is cool. But oh my God, we got to the week where we had to read John Locke, and it's in the second treatise on the Lockean proviso, right? So how do you acquire property in the first place? You mix your labor with it, and in order for that to be fine, you need to make sure that no one has a complaint, and the way to do that is to make sure that you leave enough and is good for other people. That part, right?
Yeah,
that's the gist of it. But when you read the original text, you read through it, and nothing is true, nothing works, nothing makes sense. There are bits and pieces that are kind of, you can recognize them, but almost everything it says about human history, about the origin of society and humanity, it's not just false, but it's blatantly false. And I don't blame the guy. How could he know?
Right.
It was a couple hundred years ago. There's no way he could know. He was a genius. He did his best at the time, but that doesn't mean that comparatively speaking, we can't do much better now. And people are still currently debating the acquisition of property and this proviso style, and it's so much better than Locke. Right? How could it not be?
Yeah.
People would have to be such monumental idiots, right, to come after Locke and the hundreds of years of debate on Locke to not be infinitely better than the guy himself. It almost couldn't be otherwise. And I think that's fine to admit that. It may even be fine to start with a little bit of history in teaching philosophy. Maybe not, but maybe that's a valid approach. Precisely because the level is kind of low, so you want to start with it, and you couldn't introduce students to the topic by starting with the most sophisticated contemporary debates on property and how it works and where you get it from. I get it, but still, I think in many cases, and this goes back to the point that you mentioned, we just judge. In many cases, we judge these people by really, well, surprisingly low standards sometimes, and people get praised for being so insightful, and then the insight is actually whales are mammals. And that was an important discovery, right? But my kids know that, so it's just not impressive anymore, and it's fine.
That was excellent. It's exactly how I when you go back and you read philosophers from the past, it's not that they, like you said, it's not that they're not geniuses. If they were alive now, they'd be better at philosophy than I am. But if I was put back then, for sure. But if I sent you back then to talk to John Locke, I mean, he would not be able to keep up. There's just no way, because
every physicist today at the University of Boaty McBoatface is better than Einstein. Of course, how could they not be?
Exactly. Yeah, and you know what? Einstein is a good one to bring up too here, because he really cared whether the interesting ideas he was coming up with were true. Mm-hmm. He really wanted to know whether they were true. Yeah. So, and in fact, I think he deserves a little more credit for that, because a lot of people in the history of philosophy are just saying what they like. They're just saying what they like, and they're going to make an argument about what they like. And then if it's true, that's great. And and like with things like Socratic dialogues, I feel like that's, well, you know how everybody wanted to watch the Johnny Depp cross-examinations during his trial? You know, just to see two people arguing.
Vaguely, yeah. Well, I've heard of it, but
you know how people
what happened?
Well, it's not. It's just broader. But you know how people like to watch people argue? They're just on
Yeah.
Facebook or Twitter
Oh yeah.
or whatever. That's the Socratic dialogues. If you read that now with a modern understanding, you're not going to get any information out of it. You're just going to have you're going to have fun watching two people argue. That's it. That's why it persists.
So I love. I mean, when in film the second half starts and they're in court, I'm happy.
Exactly.
Right? And so I loved, like, some of my favorite shows are like the OJ documentary, or The Staircase, where they had the guy, like, did he kill his wife? I love them. And it's 90% is in court, and it's 10 hours, right? It's great. I think people just enjoy anything or most things that are adversarial, right? So they enjoy the competition. They enjoy the so that guy just made the 6 meters in the high jump. Will the next guy, make the 6-1, right? People love that. Or teams facing off, and likewise, people enjoy watching that sort of stuff, and that's cool, yeah. And
not a basis for teaching philosophy, though, is it?
No, but it just occurred to me that I think it's true that Einstein, he did really care about, and he did come up with potential empirical tests for stuff that he said. I mean, no one is perfect in that regard. Everyone kind of wants their own theory to be true, but at least there can be a spectrum of good faith that people have. Like, I do want to, I don't want my theory to be true, but I want the truth to be my theory, right? And there's a big difference between those two, with whether you want to be in possession of the truth or you just want to find it, right?
Absolutely.
But also, here's another thing about this, about the sometimes people will say that engaging intensively with the history of philosophy is important because it gave me my good ideas, right? And there's a famous Einstein quote as well, where he said, basically, David Hume helped me a lot in coming up with the theory of special relativity, because Hume gave me this idea that many of the concepts that we use to understand how nature works are really sort of invested by us into nature. So causality, for instance, is not something that is inherent to the billiard balls, but it's a habit in our mind to just see the one event and the other event, and to make that connection between the two, right? Roughly speaking, that's
sure.
And seeing it this way, Einstein claimed, is something that allowed him to make that switch to let's think about, we have this weird physics right now, in high velocity, objects start to behave weird, right? What do we need to change about our, as Hume taught us, somewhat arbitrary concepts in order to make everything behave somewhat more normal again, right? But I think what often happens, and of course I can't read minds, but what often happens is, I think that people would have had these ideas anyway, and then they sort of make some post hoc connection to, oh, that guy inspired me, in order to maybe also borrow some authority from an earlier genius, to lend extra credibility to their ideas. And I'm very skeptical. I mean, again, I'm not a mind reader, but I'm skeptical that Einstein really got this idea from. It's a very tenuous connection too between these two ideas, right?
Let me
connection.
Let me tell you something real quick, which is that you're I don't know about the specific instance with Einstein, but you're absolutely right that individual humans have no idea where their thoughts came from. And almost everything we think about why we thought something is a post hoc rationalization. And we know this for sure with modern scientific studies. Like
people come up with this story that makes them seem very erudite and learned. And say, oh, it was this one night I was reading Hume next to the fireplace for fun, and I had this idea, and divine inspiration came to me, and I think maybe it happened, but
they're never like, my left hemisphere.
I'm skeptical.
My left hemisphere is designed to produce context no matter what.
Exactly.
So
I don't think that has to be true. But it's another justification is that, yes, it's about the good ideas now, but many of them come from continued engagement with with good ideas back in the day. I think in many cases it's made up as a connection. And it also doesn't explain how current physicists have all these good ideas without looking at very old texts or mathematicians.
So we're coming up on our time. I really want to have you back on for your thoughts on moral change, because I think I think that would be super informative. But also I think we might, and I'm not sure, disagree more about that too. So it might be a different dynamic. But before we go, did you want to plug anything like your rationality handbook or perhaps your website?
No, I mean, well, maybe two things. I mean, I wrote this end of history paper. History of philosophy is overrated. And then I got the responses. Many of them were kind of embarrassing, I think, but there were some good ones. And I wanted to see, okay, how do I perhaps want to change my mind about this? So I wrote this companion paper called The Ends of History.
Oh, I don't think I saw it.
And I published it in the same paper. And it's sort of written in this style where I talk about myself in the third person. So it's a lot like, Sauer argues that, and I try to sort of take down my earlier points from. So people should at least be checking that out. It's actually kind of harsh towards me. I was surprised that because the referees didn't know that it was me writing and talking about myself as someone else, right?
Okay.
So there are actually a couple of pretty harsh phrases about me in the paper, and referees didn't raise them probably because they were happy that someone was insulting me, not knowing that was myself.
That's hilarious.
So that's something that I want to plug, at least to get the full picture of the revised, updated End of History 2.0. It's called The Ends of History. And I have a book coming up that's going to come out in English in next year, probably in fall 2024. It's called The Invention of Good and Evil, a world history of morality. And it tells the story of human morality in 7 chapters. It starts 5 million years ago, then 500,000 years, 50,000, 5,000, 550, and 5, up until the present. And it's supposed to give this grand narrative of where our norms and values and institutions and all these bits and pieces of our normative infrastructure come from. And it did really well in Germany and other places. And I'm very interested in what the English-speaking world will think, which is a big part of my audience.
Yeah, I can't wait for that. I will definitely. You've sold 1 copy at least. I'll tell you that.
Cool.
So.
Yeah. Oh, thank you.
All right. Well, with that, then, thank you again for being on the podcast, and
thank you for having me.
Hope to have you back soon.